On my last video, I have gotten a lot of comments telling me to make a pitch for Absolute Spider-Man, and of course, I am the man of the people, so I have created the best Absolute Spider-Man pitch ever. This Absolute Spider-Man idea perfectly fits into DC's new Absolute Universe alongside Absolute Batman and alongside Absolute Wonder Woman. Now, if you're unaware of what Absolute versions of superheroes are, or you haven't seen my last video, a short summary of Absolute Superheroes are a new comic line DC has started where they take away a core aspect of a character and see how it changes them. The most iconic one, of course, is Absolute Batman, where instead he didn't grow up rich and grew up in crime alley, and because of that he instead had to become 10 times stronger to make up for not having all this cool tech, but is still Batman at heart and wants to help everyone. And this Absolute Batman gets a cool new costume that utilizes weapons that an average man can get, like knives for ears and an axe as a bat symbol. DC has been doing this with a lot of characters recently, like an Absolute Green Lantern, an Absolute Flash, an Absolute Superman, and so much more. But that is just a brief overview of what an absolute version of a superhero could look like, and I wanted to take this idea and apply it to Spider-Man, the most iconic superhero in the Marvel universe. But before I get into that, I just wanted to ask you guys to hit that subscribe button, because 99% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so don't be that 99%. Hit that subscribe button, it's free. But let's get back into the video. So we have already seen people create their sketches of what an Absolute Spider-Man could look like, but most of the time it's just a parody of Absolute Batman. But I wanted to take a more serious approach, and I wanted to lay out for you guys what an Absolute Spider-Man story could look like if we took away a core aspect of Spider-Man. So the whole Absolute version is that we take away something that makes him a better superhero, but it still has to stay true to the character. For Batman, we took away his money, but he's still fighting crime with just different tools. And for Superman, he didn't grow up on a farm, instead he grew up on Krypton, but still fights for the weak because he knows what it feels like not to be able to save yourself because he watched his parents die in Krypton. So what I wanted to take away from Spider-Man's backstory to fit on this theme was pretty difficult because Spider-Man's backstory is so iconic, it's hard to mess with anything in it. But I decided the thing I wanted to take away from Spider-Man that would make Spider-Man fit perfectly into the Absolute Universe was, what if we took away Uncle Ben? Now, I know that might sound crazy. Without Uncle Ben, we don't get the iconic quote of, "With great power comes great responsibility." But let me cook for a second, because I want Spider-Man to not have Uncle Ben teach him with great power comes great responsibility, but instead, this version of Spider-Man learns it on his own. So here's how I would approach taking away Uncle Ben from Spider-Man's backstory. So instead of Uncle Ben and Aunt May taking Peter in at a young age, instead, Peter becomes an orphan. And the reason why Peter becomes an orphan is because in this version, Uncle Ben and Aunt May died before Peter's parents abandoned him, so Peter ends up growing up in a foster home. Now, it really doesn't matter what happens to Peter's parents. They could have died, abandoned him, or even become secret agents that control underground trains like an Amazing Spider-Man for all I care. The point is, it doesn't really matter what happened to his parents because they are out of Peter's life from this point on. So from this point on is where we get Absolute Spider-Man. So this Spider-Man grows up in a foster home and has to fend for himself during his upbringing. And just like with any orphan, he has a rough childhood growing up. But one thing does stay the same. He still makes one friend, and that is of course the one and only Harry Osborn. So this Peter resents his foster home because he truly feels no connection to anyone there, and instead spends most of his time with Harry. And this is where we get the big change for Absolute Spider-Man when it comes to his villain. Just like how Absolute Batman's villains change throughout the story, like the Joker not being funny or Black Mask being a totally different version of Black Mask. In this version, we have Norman Osborn being the Iron Patriot from the beginning. And since he's the Iron Patriot from the beginning, he has a really good public image for being a superhero and also a successful businessman. Now, if you don't know anything about Iron Patriot, you might be confused why Norman Osborn would be an Iron Patriot, but in the comics, Norman Osborn became Iron Patriot after being the Green Goblin to atone for his sins as being a villain. So unlike the MCU, the comics version, Norman Osborn was always the Iron Patriot. But in this version, Absolute Spider-Man, we do the opposite, where we have Norman Osborn starting off being the hero, or at least seem to be a public hero. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this, so let me cook for a second. This is all gonna come together, just wait. So this Peter sees Norman Osborn as a symbol of greatness because he was able to become a hero and was a person who lifted himself up to riches. So this is what Peter aspires to be like. So now that we have the groundwork laid out for Peter's backstory, this is when he gets his powers. Like always, he gets his powers on a field trip, gets bitten by a spider, and goes through his transformation. But unlike the regular Spider-Man story, this Spider-Man is actually excited to have these powers. He sees it as a gift to become like his idol, Norman Osborn, the Iron Patriot. So this version of Peter quickly tries to learn his powers to become a hero, to be more like Iron Patriot. So he rushes into becoming a hero and relies more on his power than being agile like Spider-Man usually is. Since this Peter has lived in a foster home and lived in a rough neighborhood, he has learned to fend for himself, so this Peter ends up becoming more of a brawler type Spider-Man. I also wanted to make this Spider-Man a little shorter than usual to fit this more brawler Spider-Man aesthetic. I wanted to make him 5'5", because since he grew up poorer than usual, he didn't eat the right food and didn't have the right diet to grow into his usual 5'10" height that he usually is in the comics. So this Spider-Man would have more of a Manny Pacquiao type build, so this Spider-Man would end up becoming a more stockier, shorter Spider-Man. So this version of Absolute Spider-Man ends up taking down criminals easier than usual because of his experience of fighting bullies movies and being more aware of crimes because he grew up in a rough neighborhood. So this Spider-Man ends up becoming more street smart than science smart. Since this Spider-Man is more street smart than science smart, we will just have this Spider-Man start off with having web shooters as being part of his space powers, like how in the OG Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies have him being able to shoot webs from his body, instead of this version of Absolute Spider-Man having to make them because he is not quite smart enough in this version. So this Spider-Man starts taking down criminals left and right because of his street knowledge, and also because he really doesn't have to return back home like the usual Spider-Man does, because in the usual Spider-Man stories he has to return to Aunt May, usually has a curfew he has to abide by, but this Spider-Man can do this all day and all night. So he realistically could be heroing all night if he wanted to. So because of this Spider-Man ends up taking down a lot of criminals out really fast because of his no curfew rule, and this version of Spider-Man becomes a real vigilante as a person who kind of does all his crimes at night and kind of has that more Amazing Spider-Man aesthetic in Amazing Spider-Man 1, where the police kind of see him more as a threat than a hero, but the people living in the rough neighborhoods see Spider-Man as more of an icon for helping the little guys. But more importantly, because he gets this recognition, Norman Osborn's Iron Patriot begins to notice him. So this Peter is excited because he finally gets noticed by his idol, the man he's trying to be like. Then on one day on Absolute Spider-Man's heroing journey, he sees Iron Patriot's Norman Osborn fighting his arch nemesis Green Goblin in the city. Now if you know anything about Green Goblin, you know where I'm going with this. So Absolute Spider-Man sees this battle going on and decides to go help Norman Osborn fight Green Goblin. And Spider-Man comes in swinging and punches Green Goblin, knocking him right off his glider. And this version of Green Goblin ends up falling on top of a building with just one punch. That's when Spider-Man realizes Green Goblin was way too easy to defeat, and Norman Osborn comes flying to the rooftop with Spider-Man and Green Goblin out of the public's eye. And that's when Green Goblin takes off his mask and says, "Hey man, why'd you punch me so hard?" And Spider-Man is completely confused by Green Goblin's response and says, "Because you're attacking innocent people, obviously." That's when Iron Patriot reveals to Spider-Man that this is just an act, a facade. He does all this heroing and creating fake villains to give people hope. He says stopping crime isn't possible to do, but he says that giving hope to the masses is much easier than stopping all crime. That's when Absolute Spider-Man has this realization this was just all an act to increase Norman Osborn's public image. There is no Iron Patriot, there is no Green Goblin, they are all Norman Osborn. And this version of Absolute Spider-Man can't comprehend the idea of a businessman being so greedy and so corrupt to give hope to the people just to increase his influence, because this version of Spider-Man doesn't really have the knowledge of the business side of real life. And Norman Osborn sees the shock on Spider-Man's face and uses it to manipulate him and says, "You can be a part of this all. You can also be a part of inspiring hope to the masses like I do." That's when Spider-Man realizes that his greatest idol, the man he tried to be like, was just a fake, a lie, told by a man who wanted to increase his numbers. That's when Spider-Man realizes that he doesn't want to be this false idol, he wants to be a real superhero. He wanted to be the Iron Patriot he imagined in his mind. And in that moment, he rejects Norman Osborn's invite to join him and potentially make all the money he dreamed of to lift himself out of poverty and do all the things that come with that. He could have rushed into where Norman Osborn was, but he chooses not to. This Absolute Spider-Man chooses to be the hero that he wanted Norman Osborn to be. He wanted him to be a real hero, so in that moment, he realizes with all this power that Norman Osborn has, he used it in the worst way possible to become a fake hero, a false idol for all the masses. And Spider-Man decides with all his power, he will become the symbol he wanted Norman Osborn to be, and learns in this moment by himself, without Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility, because he has seen what a man becomes like when they don't have any responsibility with all this power. But that is just my pitch for Absolute Spider-Man. There is obviously some spots in the story that can be filled with better writing. It's not perfect, but I think it's a pretty solid idea of what an Absolute Spider-Man can be. I very much like having the idea of Spider-Man being a real hero who's treated like a vigilante, while we have Norman Osborn on the other side being a pretender who is treated like a hero. To kind of give a yin and yang that Spider-Man and Green Goblin always have, just in a different version of having a version of what two heroes could look like. But this is just my pitch for Absolute Spider-Man. I would love to know what you guys think of this. There are obviously so many ways you can go with Absolute Spider-Man. I thought about so many while making this video, like for example, what if Spider-Man was adopted by Norman Osborn, or the idea of what if instead of getting Spider-Man powers, he starts off with the symbiote powers. But let me know what you guys think of this outline of Absolute Spider-Man. Obviously, I would love to hear all of your guys' ideas and pitches for Absolute Spider-Man, and see if you guys can create a better idea than mine, because I saw so many great pitches in my last video in the comment section down below. My favorite one was Absolute Daredevil comment, and I thought was pretty amazing and was a pretty good pitch. So I would love to hear your guys' pitches for Absolute Superheroes, and let me know if you guys want to see any more pitches like this. Just leave it down in the comments below. But I hope to see you guys next time. Later, hater. Peace.